My daughter-in-law stood in the doorway of the house I had owned since 1998 and told me, loud enough for the neighbors raking leaves across the street to hear, "This is my home now. You're not welcome here." My son was standing 2 feet behind her, looking down at the welcome mat I had bought at a craft fair in Beaverton 15 years ago. He did not lift his head. He did not say my name. I had a casserole dish in my hands wrapped in a clean kitchen towel, still warm through the cotton, and I held it for another moment before I turned around and walked back to my car. What she did not know, what neither of them knew, was that the deed to that house had carried only one name on it for 28 years, and that name was mine. I am sitting at the kitchen table this evening with a mug of chamomile tea going cold beside me, watching the November dusk settle low over the rooftops. My name is Marigold Whitaker. I am 68 years old, a retired librarian, and I live in a small craftsman home in Salem, Oregon, about 40 minutes south of the house in question. My knees ache when the weather turns, and I had a small stroke 2 summers ago that left a faint tremor in my left hand. But I am still here, still thinking clearly, still capable of remembering exactly where every important document in my life is filed. What I want to tell you about is the Thanksgiving I was turned away from my own front porch, and the certified letter that arrived 3 weeks later, and the 14 phone calls I did not answer. By the time this story is finished, I think you will understand why a quiet woman who spent 41 years shelving books learned that sometimes the strongest answer you can give is the one written down on paper long before anyone thinks to ask. The house on Magnolia Street had been ours since the autumn of 1998. My husband Foster and I bought it the year our son Bennett turned 11, after Foster's promotion at the regional bank finally made the down payment possible. It was a 2-story colonial with green shutters and a wraparound porch, the kind of house that looks like it was drawn by a child who had been told to draw a home. We chose it because of the kitchen, which had a long center island and a window over the sink that looked out into a backyard where the maple turned a particular shade of red every October that I have not seen anywhere else. I cooked our first Thanksgiving dinner in that kitchen 6 weeks after we moved in, with cardboard boxes still stacked along the dining room wall and Bennett doing his homework at the unfamiliar table. Foster passed away 9 years ago this March. Heart attack in the garden on a Sunday morning. He had been pruning the rose bushes along the back fence and I had been inside making coffee, and by the time I came out with 2 cups in my hands, he was already gone. After the funeral, after the lawyer's office, after the long, quiet weeks of paperwork, I made a single decision that I did not discuss with anyone. I kept the deed exactly as it had been since the day we signed the closing documents in 1998. My name alone. Foster and I had structured it that way for tax reasons neither of us had fully understood at the time, and I had simply never changed it. I told no one, not even Bennett. Bennett married Celeste in the spring of 2019. The wedding was held at a vineyard outside Dundee, with white chairs set out among the rows of Pinot Noir vines and a string quartet playing softly under a canvas tent. Celeste wore an ivory gown with a long lace train, and she walked down the aisle on the arm of her stepfather because her own father had not been invited. I noticed that at the time and said nothing. Foster had been gone 2 years by then, and I sat in the front row in a navy blue dress with a small pearl pin at the collar, holding the program in my lap and watching my son look at his bride the way Foster had once looked at me at a kitchen table in 1976. Celeste was 34, 6 years younger than Bennett, and she worked in commercial real estate in downtown Portland. She was tall and slim with chestnut hair she kept cut in a precise bob just above her shoulders, and she had a particular way of smiling that involved only the lower half of her face. The eyes stayed measuring. I noticed that at the reception when she met my sister Hazel for the first time, and again at Christmas that year, when she opened the hand-knitted scarf I had made for her and held it up between her fingers like she was assessing its resale value. She thanked me warmly. She folded it back into the tissue paper. I did not see her wear it once over the next 4 winters. For the first 2 years of their marriage, things were ordinary in the way that family things often are. Bennett and Celeste lived in a rented condominium in the Pearl District, and they came down to Salem for Sunday dinners every 3 or 4 weeks. Celeste would bring a bottle of wine she had chosen carefully and tell me about whichever new restaurant they had tried in Portland that month. Bennett would sit at the table and laugh too loudly at her stories and refill her glass before she asked. I noticed that as well. I had noticed it the first time they came to dinner as an engaged couple. The way Bennett seemed to be performing a version of himself I did not entirely recognize. But I told myself that new love does that to people. I told myself a great deal during those years. Then in the autumn of 2021, something began to shift. Celeste started asking questions about the house on Magnolia Street. Small questions at first, the kind you might ask out of polite curiosity. How much did we pay for it back in 1998? Whether the property taxes had gone up significantly in the last decade. Whether the foundation had ever needed repair. I answered the way I would have answered any acquaintance, with general information and no specific figures, and she would nod and tuck the information away somewhere behind those measuring eyes. Bennett, sitting across from me at the dinner table, never seemed to be paying attention to the conversation. He was always looking at his phone or refilling something or laughing about something else. One evening in February of 2022, Celeste asked me directly, with the kind of casual lightness that real estate agents use when they are about to make an offer, whether I had ever thought about putting the house in Bennett's name. For tax purposes, she said. For estate planning, she said. She said her firm had a team of attorneys who handled exactly these kinds of transfers, and that they could make the entire process simple and quick. I looked at her across my own dining room table in my own house, sitting in the chair Foster used to sit in, and I told her I would think about it. She smiled with the lower half of her face. Bennett did not look up from his phone. I did not bring up the house again, and neither did she, not for several months. But I noticed that the visits to Salem became more frequent that spring. Celeste would suggest dropping by on a Saturday afternoon, just to check on me, just to see how I was managing the yard work, just to bring me a coffee from the new place she had discovered on the drive down. She would walk through the rooms of my house with the slow, appraising gaze I had seen her use at the wedding reception when she counted the guests at her stepfather's table. She would pause in the kitchen and run her hand along the granite countertop Foster, and I had installed in 2008. She would step into the back bedroom and ask whether the closet had always been that deep. She would stand at the window over the sink and look out at the maple tree in the yard and tell me with that careful lower-face smile what a treasure the place was. In May of that year, Bennett called me on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual because Bennett never called on weekdays. His voice was thinner than usual, the way it had been when he was 16 and had broken a neighbor's window with a baseball and needed to confess. He said that he and Celeste were thinking about starting a family. He said that the condominium in Portland was too small, that they wanted a real home with a yard, that Celeste had grown up in a house with a garden and felt strongly about giving their future children the same kind of upbringing. He said all of this in one continuous breath, the way you read a statement off a card, and then he stopped and waited. I sat in the kitchen with the phone against my ear and the late spring light coming through the window over the sink, and I asked him what exactly he was telling me. He said Celeste had suggested that perhaps I might consider downsizing. There were lovely senior communities in Salem, he said. Easy maintenance. Other people my age. He said the words my age the way you might say a stranger's name you were not sure how to pronounce. I told him I would think about it. I had said the same words to Celeste 3 months earlier, and I said them now with the same neutral tone I had used as a librarian for 41 years when patrons asked me whether a book was available. I did not give him a yes. I did not give him a no. I gave him the space to fill in whatever he needed to fill in, and then I told him I loved him and hung up the phone. I sat at the kitchen table for a long while afterward, looking at the maple tree through the window. Foster had planted that tree the spring after we moved in. He had been gone almost 7 years by then, and the tree was taller than the second-story gutters. The next morning, I drove to the office of an attorney named Whitley Brennan, whose name I had been carrying on a slip of paper in my wallet for almost a year. He was a probate and estate lawyer in downtown Salem, recommended to me by a woman in my book club whose own family had been through something complicated after her husband died. Whitley was in his late 50s, with a steady manner and an office that smelled faintly of leather and lemon polish. I told him I needed him to look over my deed and my will and my financial accounts, and make absolutely certain that nothing about any of it could be moved or modified by anyone other than me. He listened without interrupting. He took notes on a yellow legal pad in small, even handwriting. Whitley called me back 3 days later. He had pulled the deed from the county recorder's office in Marion County and confirmed what I already knew. The property at the address on Magnolia Street had been held in my name alone since the closing in November of 1998. Foster had never been listed. There had been no transfer, no quitclaim, no addition of a second party at any point in the intervening decades. The house was mine and only mine, and any attempt by another party to claim ownership or occupancy without my consent would have no legal standing whatsoever. Whitley said this last part slowly, the way a teacher repeats an important sentence to make sure the class has heard it. I thanked him and told him I would be in touch. I did not change anything. I did not need to. I simply asked Whitley to keep the file open and to be available if I needed him. He said he would. He said he had seen this kind of thing before and that it was wise to be prepared, and that I should not hesitate to call him at any hour if the situation required it. I wrote his cell phone number on the inside flap of my address book and put the book back in the drawer of the kitchen telephone table. The summer passed quietly on the surface. Bennett and Celeste came down for the 4th of July, and Celeste brought a peach cobbler from a bakery in Portland and told me 3 times how much she admired the ceiling fan in the dining room. I noticed that she had begun taking photographs of various rooms in the house when she thought I was not looking. Small, discreet pictures with her phone, the kind you take when you are documenting a property. I saw her once from the hallway, standing in the master bedroom doorway, framing the room carefully and tapping the screen. I did not say anything. I walked past her on my way to the linen closet and asked if she wanted iced tea. She put the phone in her pocket and smiled with the lower half of her face and said, "Yes, please." In August, Bennett called again. He said Celeste had found a wonderful senior living community just off Lancaster Drive. They had brochures. They had model units. The 2 of them wanted to take me on a tour the following Saturday. I told him I appreciated the thought, but that I was not ready to make any changes to my living situation. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Bennett said, in a voice that did not quite sound like his own, that Celeste was disappointed I was being so resistant. I noted the word resistant. I noted the construction of the sentence, the way my son had become the messenger for his wife's disappointment rather than the speaker of his own. I told him I loved him and ended the call. A week later, a real estate agent named Caroline Vega left a voicemail on my home phone. She said she had been referred to me by Celeste Whitaker and that she would love to come by and give me a free no-obligation valuation of the property at my convenience. I deleted the message. 2 days after that, another agent called, then a third. Within 10 days, I had received calls from 5 different real estate professionals in the greater Salem area, all of them referred by Celeste, all of them offering free valuations and no-obligation conversations and warm assurances about the strength of the current market. I kept a small notebook in the drawer next to the address book, and I wrote each name down, along with the date and time of the call. The notebook was a habit I had picked up from 41 years of cataloging. October came in cool and bright that year. The maple in the backyard turned the same red it had been turning since 1998, and I raked the leaves into piles along the back fence the way Foster used to. My hand trembled more than usual that autumn, and I had to stop twice to rest on the wooden bench beside the rose bushes, but I finished the job in a single afternoon. That same week, Bennett called and told me that he and Celeste would be hosting Thanksgiving this year. I said that was a lovely idea and asked where. He paused. He said they had been thinking, and they wondered whether it might make sense to host it at the Magnolia Street house. The dining room there was so much larger, he said. There was room for Celeste's mother and her stepfather and her 2 sisters and their families. It would be like a proper family gathering, he said. I would not have to do any of the cooking. Celeste would handle everything. I told him that sounded wonderful and that of course they were welcome to host at my house. I asked what time he wanted me to arrive and what I should bring. There was another pause. Bennett said Celeste had been thinking about that too. She thought it might be more comfortable for everyone if I came a little later after the main meal, perhaps for dessert and coffee. She did not want me to feel overwhelmed by the crowd, he said. She wanted to make sure I had a peaceful evening. I sat in the kitchen with the phone against my ear and watched a single yellow leaf drift past the window over the sink. I told my son that I understood completely and that I would plan to arrive around 7 o'clock. He sounded relieved. He told me he loved me. He hung up the phone before I could say it back. I sat at the kitchen table for a long while after that call. I thought about the 26 Thanksgivings I had cooked in that house. The first one in 1998 with Bennett at 11, doing his homework at the unfamiliar table. The one in 2003 when Foster's mother came up from Medford and we set the dining room table for 9. The one in 2014 when Bennett brought his first serious girlfriend home, a kind, quiet woman named Penelope who had baked a pecan pie from her grandmother's recipe. The Thanksgiving after Foster died, when Bennett and I sat alone at the long dining table and barely spoke, because there were no words for what had been taken out of the room. I thought about all of that, and I thought about Celeste's photographs in the master bedroom doorway, And I thought about the 5 real estate agents who had called, and I thought about Bennett's voice on the phone saying the word resistant. And then I got up from the table and walked to the telephone drawer and pulled out my address book. I opened it to the inside flap where I had written Whitley Brennan's cell phone number, and I copied the number onto a fresh slip of paper, and I put the paper in my wallet behind my driver's license. I did not call him yet. There was nothing for him to do. There was no legal action being taken, no document being threatened, no claim being made on paper. There was only a quiet rearrangement of family that had begun 2 years earlier and was now coming into clearer view. But I wanted his number close to me. I wanted to know that if the rearrangement became something else, something with weight to it, I would not have to dig through a drawer to find the right hand to reach for. In the 3 weeks leading up to Thanksgiving, I did several small things that I did not discuss with anyone. I drove to the county recorder's office in downtown Salem on a Tuesday morning and requested a certified copy of the deed to the house on Magnolia Street. The clerk was a young woman with a butterfly tattoo on her wrist, and she printed the document while I waited, and she stamped it with the raised seal of Marion County and slid it across the counter in a manila folder. The cost was $11. I paid in cash. I took the folder home and placed it inside a larger envelope along with a copy of my will and the original closing documents from 1998, and I put the envelope in the locked drawer of the roll-top desk in the spare bedroom. I drove past the house on Magnolia Street twice that month. Not to stop, not to knock, just to drive past. The first time was on a Sunday afternoon, and I saw Celeste's silver Lexus in the driveway and a contractor's van parked along the curb. The second time was a Wednesday evening, and there were lights on in rooms that had been dark since Foster died. I noticed that the curtains in the dining room had been changed. The ones Foster and I had hung in 2011, heavy cream-colored linen with a subtle pattern of leaves, had been replaced with something sleeker and grayer. I drove the rest of the way around the block and went home. I did not say anything to Bennett about it during our next phone call. 3 days before Thanksgiving, Celeste called me directly for the first time in almost a year. She said she wanted to coordinate the dessert situation. She said that her mother was bringing a pumpkin pie, her sister was bringing an apple tart, and she herself was making a flourless chocolate torte from a recipe she had clipped from a magazine. She said it might be best if I did not bring anything sweet, since the dessert table was already quite full. She said perhaps I could bring a small side dish if I wanted to contribute, something simple, nothing that needed reheating. I told her I would bring my green bean casserole, the one I had made every Thanksgiving since 1998. There was a brief silence on the line. Then she said in her brightest voice that would be lovely. Thanksgiving Day arrived with a thin gray rain that had been falling since dawn. I made the casserole in my kitchen in Salem, layering the green beans with the cream of mushroom soup and the fried onions exactly the way I had done for 26 years, and I covered it with a clean white towel and set it on the passenger seat of my car. I dressed carefully. A dark plum sweater Foster had bought me one Christmas, a string of small pearls he had given me on our 30th anniversary, the same wedding band I had worn since 1976. I put on my good wool coat. I put my wallet with Whitley Brennan's number in the inside pocket. I drove the 40 minutes north to Magnolia Street with the windshield wipers moving slowly across the glass and a soft instrumental program playing on the public radio station. I arrived at 6:53 in the evening. The house was lit from within, and through the front windows I could see figures moving in the dining room, the warm yellow light catching the edge of what appeared to be a long table set with china and candles. I parked along the curb behind a black SUV I did not recognize. I picked up the casserole dish from the passenger seat. I walked up the path Foster had laid in the summer of 2002, the brick still uneven where the maple roots had pushed it up over the years. I climbed the 3 steps to the wraparound porch and stood for a moment in front of the door I had walked through more than 10,000 times since 1998. The wreath hanging from the brass knocker was not mine. It was made of dried orange slices and cinnamon sticks tied with a black ribbon, the kind of thing you see in a design magazine, and it had been hung in the exact center of the door where I had always hung the simple grapevine wreath Foster's mother had made for us the first year. I rang the doorbell. I heard footsteps approach from the inside, light and quick on the hardwood floor I had refinished in 2016. Celeste opened the door. She was wearing a dark green dress with a thin gold belt, and her hair was pinned back from her face, and her makeup had been done with the kind of precision that suggests a professional appointment. She looked at me. She looked at the casserole dish in my hands. She did not step back to let me in. She stood with one hand still on the doorknob and the other resting against the frame, and she lowered her voice to a register that was not quite a whisper, but was clearly intended to carry only as far as the porch. She said this was her home now. She said it was Bennett's home, and her home, and that they had decided as a couple that it was no longer appropriate for me to have free access to it. She said the holiday gathering tonight was a private family event for her side of the family and Bennett's immediate household, and that I was not welcome. She said the words "not welcome" with a small, clean enunciation, the way a real estate agent might say the words "below market value." Behind her, in the foyer, I could see over her shoulder, Bennett was standing with his hands in his pockets and his eyes fixed on the floorboards just in front of his shoes. He did not look up. He did not say my name. He did not contradict a single word his wife had spoken. I stood there on the porch for perhaps 5 seconds. I felt the cold rain misting against the back of my neck. I felt the warmth of the casserole dish still radiating up through the cotton towel into my palms. I did not raise my voice. I did not ask any questions. I had spent 41 years as a librarian, and I had learned a long time ago that you do not argue with someone who has decided to write a sentence in permanent ink. You simply note the sentence, and you walk away, and you decide later what you are going to do with the information. I turned around. I walked back down the 3 steps of the porch. I walked along the uneven brick path past the maple tree Foster had planted in the spring of 1999. I opened the passenger door of my car and set the casserole dish carefully on the seat. I closed the door. I walked around to the driver's side. I got in. I started the engine. I did not look back at the house. I drove away from Magnolia Street with the windshield wipers moving slowly across the glass and the rain pooling along the curb in long, shallow streams, and I drove south on Interstate 5 for 40 minutes back to Salem, and I did not cry. I did not feel angry. I felt the way you feel when a long-suspected diagnosis is finally confirmed in writing. The not knowing is harder than the knowing. The knowing, at least, gives you something to work with. I arrived home a few minutes past 8. I carried the casserole dish into the kitchen. I set the casserole dish on the counter and stood for a moment with my hands flat against the granite, looking out the window over the sink at my own backyard. The rain had stopped while I was driving, and the moon had come out, and the bare branches of the dogwood in the corner were lit pale silver against the wet grass. I took the towel off the casserole. The dish was still warm. I served myself a small portion on one of the everyday plates Foster, and I had bought at a tag sale in 1989, and I sat at the kitchen table by myself, and I ate it slowly. The recipe was the same one I had been making since the year my son was 11. It tasted exactly the way it had always tasted. Nothing about the green beans or the cream of mushroom or the fried onions on top knew anything about what had happened on a porch 40 miles north of where I was sitting. When I had finished eating, I washed the plate by hand and set it in the dish rack to dry. I covered the rest of the casserole with foil and put it in the refrigerator. I went into the living room and sat in the wingback chair Foster had bought me for my 50th birthday, and I picked up the book I had been reading, A History of the Oregon Trail by a professor at Willamette University. I read for 40 minutes. I retained almost none of it. The words moved past my eyes the way scenery moves past a car window when you are not really looking at anything. At 10 o'clock, I closed the book and went upstairs and got ready for bed. I slept through the night without waking once, which surprised me when I thought about it the next morning. I called Whitley Brennan from my kitchen telephone at 9:15 on the Friday after Thanksgiving. I knew he would not be in the office on the day after a holiday, but I had his cell phone number, and he had told me to call any hour. He picked up on the second ring. I told him what had happened on the porch. I told him about Celeste's photographs and the 5 real estate agents and the suggestion about the senior community on Lancaster Drive. I told him about the new curtains in the dining room and the wreath that was not mine and the way my son had stood in the foyer with his eyes on the floor. Whitley listened without interrupting. When I was finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he asked me what I wanted to do. I told him I wanted to send a certified letter to the house on Magnolia Street. I wanted the letter to inform the current occupants, by name, that the property was held in fee simple by Marigold Whitaker, the sole title holder of record since November of 1998, and that any continued occupancy of the property without the express written permission of the owner constituted an unauthorized use of the premises. I wanted the letter to give them 30 days to vacate. I wanted it to be written in plain language, but on his firm's letterhead, and I wanted a certified copy of the deed to be enclosed with it. Whitley took notes while I spoke. When I was done, he read the points back to me, and I confirmed each one. He said he could have the letter drafted by Monday morning, and that I could come to his office to review it and sign off on it before it went out. I drove to Whitley's office on Monday at 11. I reviewed the draft. I made 2 small changes to the wording. I authorized him to send it. The letter went out from Whitley's office on Tuesday, December 5th. Certified mail, return receipt requested. Whitley told me it would likely arrive at the house on Magnolia Street within 2 business days, depending on the postal route. He told me that once the green card came back signed, we would have a legal record that the occupants had been formally notified. He told me to expect a reaction. He told me not to answer my phone if it began to ring from unfamiliar numbers. He told me that any communication from either party from that point forward should go through his office, and that he would handle all correspondence on my behalf. I agreed to all of it. I left his office and drove home and made myself a pot of tea. The certified letter was signed for at 3:47 on Thursday afternoon. I know the exact time because Whitley called me at 4:15 to confirm that the return receipt had been logged in the postal tracking system. He said the signature on the green card belonged to Celeste Whitaker. He said the letter was now officially delivered. He said it would not be long. The first phone call came at 5:02 that evening. My phone was sitting on the kitchen table and the screen lit up with Celeste's name. I let it ring. The second call came 11 minutes later. The third call came at 5:36. By 7 o'clock that evening, she had called 9 times. By the time I went to bed at 10:15, she had called 14 times. She did not leave a single voicemail. I did not answer any of the calls. I put the phone in the drawer of the kitchen telephone table and went upstairs. Friday morning at 8:30, the phone began to ring again. I let it ring. At 9 o'clock, I called Whitley and told him the calls had not stopped. He told me to forward any voicemails she eventually left to his office. He told me that if she showed up in person at my house in Salem, I should not open the door and I should call him immediately. He told me he had already begun preparing the next round of documents. He told me he expected I would hear from Bennett within 24 hours. Bennett called at 4:11 on Friday afternoon. I almost did not answer. I looked at his name on the screen for a long moment, the way you look at a photograph that is older than you remember it being. Then I picked up. Bennett's voice was thinner than it had ever been. He was crying. He said he had not known. He said he had thought the house had been put in both of their names years ago, that Celeste had told him repeatedly that the transfer had been handled, that there were documents she had shown him on her laptop screen that he had not looked at closely. He said he had been a fool. He said he had not stood up for me on the porch because he had been afraid, and he did not know what he had been afraid of, and that was the worst part of all of it. He asked if I would meet him. He asked if I would meet him alone, without Celeste, anywhere I wanted, at any time I chose. I sat in the kitchen and listened to my son cry on the other end of the line, and I felt something I had not expected to feel. I felt the tiredness underneath the anger, the way you feel the floor underneath a rug when you finally lift it up. I told Bennett that I would meet him on Sunday afternoon at the diner on Commercial Street where Foster and I used to take him for pancakes when he was a boy. I told him 3 o'clock. I told him to come alone. Bennett came to the diner on Sunday afternoon wearing a flannel shirt I had bought him for his birthday 3 years earlier. He had not slept. There were dark half-moons under his eyes, and his hair was uncombed in the back the way it used to get when he was a boy and had been worrying at it with his hand. He slid into the booth across from me and folded his hands on the table and waited. I ordered him a coffee. I ordered myself a slice of marionberry pie. We did not speak until the waitress had gone. Then Bennett told me everything. He told me Celeste had been controlling their finances since the 2nd year of their marriage. He told me she had isolated him slowly from his college friends, from his cousin in Bend, from me, in a way he had not seen happening until it was already done. He told me she had drained their joint savings into an account he did not have the password for. He told me she had been planning to move into the house on Magnolia Street for at least 18 months, that she had told her sisters and her mother it was already her property, that she had even shown them the rooms during a visit in September when I had been at a book club retreat at the coast. He told me he had filed for divorce that morning. He had hired his own attorney. He had moved his clothes into a short-term rental in Portland. He had blocked Celeste's number from his phone. I let him speak until he had emptied himself out. Then I told him that I had loved him every single day of his life, and that I would continue to love him, and that he was going to have to do the hard work of becoming the man Foster had hoped he would be without me cushioning the falls anymore. I told him the house on Magnolia Street was mine and would remain mine, and that someday it would be his to inherit, but only after he had spent some years rebuilding what he had let someone else take apart. He nodded. He did not argue. He reached across the table and took my hand, the one that trembles, and he held it for a long time. Celeste vacated the house on December 29th, 2 days before Whitley's 30-day deadline. She took the new curtains with her. She left the wreath. I drove up to Magnolia Street on New Year's Eve and walked through the rooms slowly with my coat still on. The maple in the backyard was bare against a low gray sky. Foster's bench was still beside the rose bushes. I sat down on it for a long while, and I did not think about anything in particular. Bennett comes for Sunday dinner most weeks now. He helps me rake the leaves in the autumn and stack the firewood along the back fence. He has started seeing a therapist in Portland. He does not talk much about Celeste, and I do not ask. The divorce was finalized in the spring. The house is still in my name alone. It will be his someday when the time is right and not a single day before. If you are watching this and there is someone in your life who is quietly asking you to give up the things you have worked your whole life to build, I hope you will trust the small voice inside you that says wait. The papers are yours. The walls are yours. The years you spent making a home are yours. Nobody can take any of that from you unless you hand it over yourself. If this story meant something to you, please consider subscribing so you can hear the next one. Thank you for sitting with me through all of it.